Welcome back to Infidelity Tales Lab. We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Fractures. Frank Harlow stood at the edge of his property, watching the sunrise paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and reds. At 42, he had built everything he wanted: a thriving private security business specializing in high-profile personal protection, a sprawling ranch outside Billings, and a family he thought would last forever. The cold autumn air filled his lungs as he contemplated how quickly 13 years of marriage could unravel. Little signs had been accumulating for months: his wife Nora's late nights, mysterious phone calls, and the growing distance between them. Their once passionate relationship had cooled significantly since the birth of their son Max, now 14 months old. Frank headed back to the house, boots crunching on frost-covered gravel. Inside, Nora was feeding Max in his high chair, her auburn hair tied back messily, dark circles under her eyes. At 35, she was still striking, still turned heads whenever they went into town. They'd met when she was hired as a concierge at a hotel where Frank was handling security for a visiting diplomat. The attraction had been immediate, intense. "Sleep okay?" Frank asked, pouring himself coffee. "Fine," Nora replied without looking up. "You're heading to Seattle today, right?" "Yeah. Congressman Bradley needs protection for that climate summit. I should be back Friday." Frank studied his wife's face, noting how she seemed almost relieved. "You good with Max for the week?" "Of course. We'll be fine." She finally met his eyes. "Maybe the space will be good for us." Frank nodded, feeling the widening chasm between them. "We need to talk when I get back." "Really talk?" "Yes," she said, her voice distant. "We do." After breakfast, Frank packed his bags while Nora took Max to the nursery. He paused when his phone buzzed with a text from his business partner and oldest friend, Vince Sullivan. "Check your email. Something you need to see before you leave." Frank opened his secure email to find a message from Vince with an attachment labeled surveillance_SAR06. His stomach knotted as he opened the file. The images were crystal clear. Nora entering an upscale Billings hotel with a man Frank recognized instantly: Damon Fletcher, a successful local real estate developer and, more relevantly, the husband of Nora's sister Leanne. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. The timestamp showed the photos were taken just 2 days ago when he'd been in Idaho on another assignment. There were more images: Nora and Damon embracing in the elevator, their lips locked in passion. The phone rang. Vince's voice came through, heavy with concern. "Frank, I'm sorry. Leanne hired us last month, suspecting Damon was cheating. When the surveillance team recognized Nora, they contacted me immediately." Frank's voice was unnaturally calm. "How long?" "According to what we've gathered, at least 6 months. Maybe longer." 6 months. Around the time Max started sleeping through the night. When their intimacy should have rekindled, not died. "What are you going to do?" Vince asked. Frank watched through the window as Nora loaded Max into her car, presumably heading to her mother's house, as she often did on Tuesdays. "Nothing. Yet." Frank's mind was already calculating, assessing. "I'm going to Seattle as planned, but I need you to continue the surveillance. Give me everything." "What about Leanne?" "She's expecting a report. Tell her we're still gathering evidence." "Buy me time, Vince." After hanging up, Frank added one more item to his suitcase: a small leather journal where he meticulously recorded every detail of his life. He'd been keeping journals since his Army Ranger days, a habit that had served him well in building his security business. Now it would serve a different purpose. Frank had learned strategy and tactics from the military, patience from protecting high-value targets, and human psychology from handling personal security for the wealthy and powerful. He'd accumulated valuable connections across law enforcement, politics, and private industry. As he drove to the airport, Frank decided that if his marriage was truly over, he wouldn't simply walk away. He would ensure that everyone involved in destroying his family would face consequences: calculated, measured, and absolute. 3 days later, from his hotel room in Seattle, Frank received the full surveillance report from Vince. The affair was worse than he'd initially thought. Text messages suggested Nora and Damon had begun their relationship nearly a year ago, and there were hints that Damon had been pressuring Nora to leave Frank. More disturbing were the messages questioning Max's paternity. Frank closed his laptop and stared out at the Seattle skyline. 13 years of marriage, built on what appeared to be a foundation of lies. His military training had taught him to compartmentalize, to focus on objectives rather than emotions. Right now, that skill was keeping him functional. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Marianne Rodriguez, a discreet medical professional who had helped his firm with sensitive issues in the past. "I need a paternity test," Frank said when she answered. "Completely confidential." "I can arrange that," she replied. "When you get back." Frank's next call was to his attorney, Winston Heath, to discreetly discuss his options regarding divorce and custody. He ended the day by writing in his journal, outlining the beginnings of a plan that would take months to execute. He wasn't just planning a divorce. He was planning a strategic dismantling of everything Nora and Damon held dear. Chapter 2: Revelation. Frank returned from Seattle to find his home unusually immaculate, as if Nora had spent hours cleaning in anticipation of a confrontation. Max was already asleep in his crib, and Nora sat waiting in the living room, a glass of wine in hand. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but nervous. "I've been doing a lot of thinking while you were gone." Frank set down his bags and studied his wife. Was she planning to confess? To leave him? He decided to let her speak first, to see how much truth she was willing to offer. "I'm not happy, Frank," she said, eyes fixed on her wine glass. "I haven't been for a long time." Frank sat across from her, maintaining a deliberately neutral expression. "Since when? I don't know exactly. Maybe since Max was born. Maybe before." She took a deep breath. "I feel like we've grown apart. Your work takes you away constantly. When you're home, you're distant." Frank nodded slowly, noting how she was framing the narrative to place blame on him. "And you think that justifies sleeping with Damon?" The glass nearly slipped from her fingers. "What? Please don't insult me by denying it." Frank's voice remained calm. "I know about the hotel meetings, the texts, everything." Color drained from Nora's face. "How did you? Does it matter?" "What matters is that you've been having an affair with your sister's husband for at least the past year." Frank leaned forward. "What I want to know is if Max is my son." Nora's eyes widened. "Of course he's yours. How can you even ask that?" "Because according to your text with Damon, you've been questioning it yourselves." Frank watched her expression crumble. "So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, we're getting a paternity test. After that, I'll decide my next steps." Nora began crying, her composure shattering. "Frank, please. It's not what you think. Damon and it started as a mistake. I was going to end it, but you didn't." Frank stood up, "And now we all have to live with the consequences." The next day was a blur of clinical sterility as Dr. Rodriguez collected DNA samples from both Frank and Max. Nora waited in the reception area, her eyes red from a sleepless night. "Results will take a few days," Dr. Rodriguez told Frank privately. "Are you prepared for either outcome?" "Yes," Frank replied, though he wondered if anyone could truly be prepared to learn their child wasn't biologically theirs. When they returned home, Nora attempted reconciliation, suddenly affectionate in ways she hadn't been in months. Frank rebuffed her advances, spending the night in the guest room where he made preparations for what would follow. The paternity results arrived 3 days later. Max was indeed Frank's biological son. The relief was profound, but it did nothing to diminish his resolve regarding Nora and Damon's betrayal. That evening, as snow began falling outside, Frank confronted Nora with his decision. "I want a divorce," he stated simply. "I've already spoken with my attorney. We'll negotiate custody arrangements for Max, but the marriage is over." Nora's reaction surprised him. Rather than pleading or arguing, she seemed almost relieved, as if her own decision had been made easier. "Damon's leaving Leanne," she admitted. "We want to be together officially." Frank absorbed this revelation, adjusting his mental timeline accordingly. "Does Leanne know yet?" "No." Nora looked down. "Damon's telling her this weekend." Unbeknownst to Nora, Frank had already spoken with Leanne earlier that day, providing her with a full surveillance report. Her devastation had been complete, her anger raw and immediate. Frank had positioned himself as an ally in her shock and grief, laying groundwork for what would come later. "I'll be staying at the guest house on the property until we sort things out legally," Frank informed Nora. "I won't disrupt Max's routine more than necessary." That night, alone in the guest house, Frank made a series of calls. First to Winston Heath to accelerate the divorce proceedings, then to his network of contacts across Montana and beyond. By morning, he had set in motion financial maneuvers that would protect his assets while gathering intelligence on Damon Fletcher's business dealings. Frank knew from his security work that everyone had vulnerabilities. Everyone had secrets. All it took was patience and resources to uncover them. And Frank had both in abundance. As the snow continued falling, blanketing the ranch in pristine white, Frank wrote in his journal by lamplight, outlining the phases of his response. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about ensuring that actions had consequences, that betrayal exacted a price. In the coming weeks, as divorce papers were filed and custody negotiations began, Frank presented a calm, reasonable facade to the world. He agreed to temporary joint custody of Max, allowed Nora to remain in the main house, and maintained a cordial relationship with his soon-to-be ex-wife. Meanwhile, he was building a comprehensive understanding of Damon Fletcher's real estate empire, identifying pressure points and weaknesses. He was cataloging Nora's vulnerabilities as well. Her reputation in the community, her relationships with family, especially her relationship with her parents who had always adored Frank. This approach kept Frank focused, preventing the rage and hurt from consuming him. He knew that revenge served cold was more effective than emotional outbursts. By the time the divorce was finalized 3 months later, Frank had every piece in position. Now it was time to begin the real work. Chapter 3. Calculation. Spring arrived in Montana, bringing with it new beginnings. For Frank, it marked the transition from planning to action. The divorce had been finalized with surprising efficiency, largely due to Nora's eagerness to start her new life with Damon, who had likewise divorced Leanne in an acrimonious split that left the community buzzing with gossip. Frank had secured joint custody of Max, with a schedule that gave him 4 days each week with his son. To the outside world, he appeared to be handling the dissolution of his marriage with admirable dignity. He remained polite in public interactions with Nora, focused on co-parenting Max, and even wished the new couple well when they announced their engagement mere weeks after their respective divorces were finalized. Behind this facade of acceptance, however, Frank was executing the first phase of his meticulously crafted plan. First came the financial groundwork. Through shell companies established years ago for his international security contracts, Frank began acquiring the mortgage notes on several of Damon's development properties. Not enough to raise alarms, but sufficient to create leverage when the time came. Next, he cultivated his relationship with Leanne Fletcher, Nora's sister and Damon's ex-wife. Initially, their connection was based on mutual betrayal, but Frank carefully nurtured it into something that appeared romantic to outside observers. They were seen together at restaurants in Billings, at community events, and even on a weekend trip to Jackson Hole. The relationship served multiple purposes. It provided Frank with intimate knowledge of Damon's vulnerabilities through Leanne's bitter disclosures. It created a narrative of healing and moving on that kept suspicion at bay. And most importantly, it drove Nora to distraction. Despite her choice to leave Frank for Damon, the sight of her ex-husband with her sister kindled an unexpected jealousy that Frank noted and filed away as a potential pressure point. "You're playing a dangerous game," Vince warned during one of their regular strategy sessions at the guest house. "Leanne's fragile right now. If she realizes you're using her." "I'm not using her," Frank insisted, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "We've been honest about where we stand. She knows I'm not ready for another serious relationship. And the rest of your plan? The property acquisitions? The information gathering on Damon's business partners?" Vince shook his head. "Frank, you're walking a fine line between justice and obsession." Frank poured them both another whiskey. "It's not obsession. It's calculation. They think they've won, that they can build their happiness on the ruins of 2 families without consequences. I'm simply ensuring that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. By summer, Frank had compiled an extensive dossier on Damon Fletcher. The real estate developer had built his reputation on a carefully constructed image of integrity and community investment. But beneath the surface lurked questionable deals, zoning manipulations achieved through undisclosed relationships with local officials, and a pattern of selling properties with known structural issues that were cosmetically concealed. None of it was overtly criminal. Damon was too smart for that. But it all existed in ethical gray areas that could devastate his reputation and business if exposed in the right way. Frank also gathered intelligence on Nora, who had taken a position as event coordinator at one of Damon's luxury developments. Through discreet surveillance and information shared by mutual acquaintances, he documented the cracks already appearing in their relationship. Arguments about wedding plans, tensions regarding Max's place in their new family, and Damon's controlling behavior that was beginning to chafe against Nora's independent nature. Most crucially, Frank cultivated relationships with Nora's parents, Theodore and Martha Reynolds. The elder Reynolds had been devastated by their daughter's affair and the dissolution of what they had perceived as a perfect marriage. Frank regularly invited them to spend time with Max at the guest house, ensuring they remained a significant presence in his son's life while subtly reinforcing the narrative of Frank as the wronged but dignified party. "You've always been more of a son to us than Damon could ever be," Theodore told Frank during a Sunday barbecue, the older man's voice tight with emotion. "Nora made a terrible mistake." "We all make choices," Frank replied, maintaining his carefully constructed persona of growth and forgiveness. "What matters now is Max's happiness." Martha squeezed his hand. "You're a good father, Frank, and a good man." In private, Frank continued documenting every development in his journal, adjusting his strategy as new information came to light. He learned from military operations that even the best plans required flexibility, adaptation to changing circumstances. The most significant of these adaptations came in late August, when Vince discovered that Damon had been pressuring Nora to reduce Frank's custody time with Max. According to the information gathered, Damon wanted Max to see him as a father figure, part of creating the perfect family image he craved. This revelation solidified the timing for Frank's next move. While he had originally planned to wait until after Nora and Damon's November wedding, this direct threat to his relationship with Max accelerated his timeline. "They want to play family at my expense," Frank told Vince as they reviewed the intelligence. "That's a miscalculation they'll regret." The next day, Frank invited Leanne to dinner at his guest house, where he shared a carefully edited version of his discoveries about Damon's business practices. As expected, she was eager to use the information in her ongoing disputes with her ex-husband over their financial settlement. "He hid assets during our divorce," Leanne fumed. "I knew it, but my lawyer couldn't prove it. This could change everything." Frank nodded sympathetically. "You deserve your fair share, Leanne, but timing is everything. Let's be strategic about how we use this information." As summer turned to fall, Frank monitored the escalating conflicts between Nora and her parents, who had begun openly questioning her judgment regarding Damon and expressing concerns about Max's well-being in the new household. Frank had subtly facilitated these tensions, sharing select observations about Max's behavior after visits with Nora and Damon, planting seeds of doubt that grew into full-blown family conflict. By October, the stage was set for the next phase. Thanksgiving was approaching, the first major holiday since the divorces, and Frank knew it would be the perfect backdrop for what came next. The Reynolds family had always made a production of Thanksgiving, gathering extended family from across Montana for an elaborate celebration. This year would be different. This year would mark the beginning of the end for Nora and Damon's illusion of happily ever after. Frank made one final journal entry before initiating the next phase. Everything is in position. They believe they've escaped consequences, that their betrayal has faded into the background of new beginnings. They're wrong. In chess, the player who thinks several moves ahead ultimately controls the board. I've been thinking dozens of moves ahead while they've been playing checkers. Thanksgiving will be the opening gambit of the endgame. Chapter 4. Escalation. October bled into November, painting Montana with autumn's fading palette. Frank's plan entered its critical phase as Thanksgiving approached, a date circled in his journal with meticulous notes surrounding it. The custody arrangement had Max scheduled to be with Nora for Thanksgiving Day and with Frank for the weekend after. This timing was perfect for what Frank had engineered. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Frank orchestrated his first major move. Using the information he'd gathered on Damon's questionable business practices, he anonymously tipped off 3 of Damon's investors about potential liabilities in their joint ventures. Not enough to trigger immediate legal action, but sufficient to create cracks in Damon's carefully constructed business facade. The effects were quickly apparent. Damon began spending long hours at his office, trying to contain the spreading anxiety among his business partners. His planned hunting trip with potential investors was canceled, and the stress followed him home, creating tension with Nora that rippled through their relationship. Frank monitored these developments through his network of contacts and Leanne's regular updates. He maintained his outward persona of the amicable ex-husband, even offering to take Max for extra days when Nora mentioned Damon's increasing irritability at home. He's just under a lot of pressure with this new development, Nora explained during a custody handoff, dark circles evident under her eyes. The investors are getting cold feet for some reason. That's tough, Frank replied sympathetically. Business can be unpredictable. While Damon struggled professionally, Frank activated the next part of his plan through Theodore and Martha Reynolds. Having cultivated their trust and sympathy over months, he now suggested they host Thanksgiving at their home rather than at Nora and Damon's new house as originally planned. Max has been having trouble adjusting to the new environment, Frank mentioned carefully to Martha. The familiarity of your home might make the holiday easier for him. Martha latched onto the idea immediately, calling Nora that same day to insist on hosting. The resulting argument, which Martha tearfully recounted to Frank, centered on Damon's desire to showcase their new home versus the established family tradition of gathering at the Reynolds residence. Ultimately, the parents prevailed, but the conflict deepened the growing rift between Nora and her family. More importantly, it provided Frank with a necessary setting for what would follow. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Frank paid a visit to Boyd Kettering, the elderly owner of a struggling hardware store in Billings who had once helped a young Frank find work when he first moved to Montana after leaving the military. Over the years, Frank had repaid that kindness many times over, helping Boyd modernize his inventory system and providing security upgrades when a string of robberies hit local businesses. "I need a favor, Boyd," Frank explained, sitting in the back office cluttered with decades of paperwork. Something unusual. By the time Frank left the hardware store, Boyd had agreed to help with a key component of the Thanksgiving plan, believing he was participating in an elaborate reconciliation gesture. The day before Thanksgiving, Frank received a call from Leanne. "Damon's absolutely losing it," she reported. Meridian Capital pulled out of the River Ridge development completely. He's scrambling to find new investors before word gets out. "That's unfortunate timing," Frank remarked, his voice neutral despite the satisfaction he felt. Meridian's withdrawal was no coincidence. Their CEO owed Frank a favor after a security situation involving the man's daughter had been discreetly handled the previous year. "I've also been dropping hints about knowing his financial secrets," Leanne continued, a vindictive edge in her voice. "Just subtle comments about hidden assets. You should see how it rattles him." "Be careful," Frank cautioned. "Don't overplay your hand. Remember, timing is everything." Thanksgiving morning dawned clear and cold. Frank spent the early hours with Max, savoring their time together before the handoff to Nora scheduled for noon. He dressed his son in a new outfit, a miniature version of what Frank himself would wear later, and packed a small overnight bag. At 11:30, Frank received the text message he'd been waiting for from Boyd. Package delivered according to instructions. "Good luck, son." Everything was in place. Frank dressed carefully in a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie, Nora's favorite combination during happier times. He packed the specially prepared gift into his truck alongside Max's car seat and began the drive to the Reynolds family home. Frank arrived precisely at noon. From his truck, he could see the gathered vehicles, Nora's SUV, Damon's ostentatious luxury sedan, and various cars belonging to other Reynolds family members. Through the large bay windows, he glimpsed figures moving about inside, preparing for the elaborate meal. Taking Max from his car seat, Frank approached the house with his son in one arm and the gift in his other hand. He wasn't expected to join the family gathering. He was merely dropping Max off as arranged in their custody agreement. But he knew his appearance would create a momentary disruption, a brief window of awkwardness that served his purpose. When he reached the front door, Frank stopped short. Affixed to the ornate oak door was a handwritten sign that hadn't been there when he drove past the previous day. Family dinner. No single dads allowed. The sign was clearly in Damon's handwriting. Frank had seen enough of the man's notes and signatures through Leanne to recognize it instantly. It was petty, childish even, but revealing of Damon's true character beneath the polished exterior. Frank stood motionless, Max warm against his chest, contemplating the calculated insult. Then, without ringing the doorbell, he quietly placed his gift on the doorstep. A beautifully wrapped box with a simple card attached, reading, "For the happy couple." Returning to his truck, Frank secured Max in his car seat and called Nora. "I'm outside your parents' house," he said when she answered. "There seems to be some confusion. There's a sign saying I'm not welcome." "What? What sign?" Nora's confusion seemed genuine. "Just come in and drop Max off." "I'd rather not create a scene," Frank replied calmly. "I'm taking Max back to my place. We can sort this out later." "Frank, wait." He ended the call and drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as Nora emerged from the house, phone still in hand, a confused expression on her face as she discovered the sign. Back at his guest house, Frank fed Max an early Thanksgiving meal he'd prepared in advance, then settled his son for a nap. While Max slept, Frank made a series of phone calls. First to Theodore Reynolds to apologize for the misunderstanding and express concern about Damon's apparent hostility, then to Vince to confirm that the next phase was ready. "Everything's set," Vince assured him. "But Frank, are you sure about this? Once we cross this line..." The line was crossed the moment they decided their happiness was worth destroying two families, Frank replied. "I'm just ensuring they understand the full cost of that decision." The following morning, Black Friday, Frank's phone began ringing at 6:38 a.m. He let it go to voicemail, already knowing what had happened. The first call was from Nora, followed by Damon, then Theodore Reynolds. By noon, there were 17 missed calls and twice as many text messages. Frank read them all, but responded to none. The messages painted a clear picture of chaos. "Frank, what the hell was in that box? Call me now." "Nora, this isn't funny. Whatever game you're playing, it's over." Damon, "Son, we need to talk. Things have gotten out of hand. Please call me." Theodore, television and local news websites filled in the details Frank already knew. Damon Fletcher, prominent real estate developer, had been taken into custody following a domestic disturbance at the Reynolds family home on Thanksgiving evening. While no formal charges have been filed, sources close to the family reported a violent altercation stemming from accusations of financial misconduct and infidelity. Frank smiled slightly as he read the reports. The contents of his gift, carefully selected financial records, text messages, and photographs documenting both Damon's business improprieties and evidence of his ongoing relationship with another woman. A relationship that had begun even before his affair with Nora, had performed exactly as intended. The gift had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed to detonate at the precise moment when family tensions were already high and Damon's professional stress was at its peak. The resulting explosion had exceeded even Frank's calculations. By evening, Frank finally responded to one message from Theodore Reynolds, inviting the older man to come to the guest house to talk. When Theodore arrived, his face was haggard, aged years in a single day. "What have you done, Frank?" he asked, accepting the offered whiskey with a shaking hand. Frank maintained his composed facade. "I simply provided information. What happened afterward was the result of Damon's choices, not mine." Theodore shook his head. "Nora is devastated. Not just about the other woman, but the things Damon said, the way he behaved." "I'm sorry she's hurting," Frank said, and part of him meant it. Despite everything, he had once loved Nora deeply. But perhaps now she understands what it feels like when the life you thought you had turns out to be built on lies. They're saying Damon hit her, Theodore said quietly, when she confronted him about the photos. Frank's expression remained neutral, though inwardly this information disturbed him. Violence against Nora had never been part of his plan. Has she filed charges? No. She's too embarrassed, too shocked by everything. Theodore drained his glass. The wedding's off, obviously. She's staying with us for now. And Max? Is he all right? He's fine. Slept through most of it. Theodore looked up, his eyes suddenly sharp despite his exhaustion. You knew, didn't you? About the other woman? About Damon's business problems? Frank met his gaze steadily. I had concerns. That's why I thought they should have all the information before getting married. Hell of a way to deliver it, Theodore muttered, but there was no real condemnation in his voice. You've always been 3 steps ahead of everyone, Frank. It's what made you so good at your job. And what about you, Theodore? What do you want now? The older man sighed heavily. I want my daughter back. The one who existed before all this mess. But that's not possible, is it? No, Frank agreed. But perhaps something better can emerge from the ruins. After Theodore left, Frank allowed himself a moment of reflection. Phase 1 had been completed. Damon's reputation was in tatters, his business relationship strained, and his relationship with Nora destroyed. Moreover, Nora was now experiencing the same devastating betrayal she had inflicted on Frank. But this was only the beginning. Frank had no intention of stopping until both Damon and Nora fully understood that every action had consequences, that betrayal always exacted its price. He opened his journal and wrote, First phase complete. Target destabilized professionally and personally. Collateral emotional impact on N higher than anticipated. Adjust accordingly for phase 2. Remember the objective, complete dismantling, not destruction. They need to live with the consequences, not escape them through sympathy or martyrdom. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Montana in a fresh blanket of white, nature's way of concealing the scars of the past beneath the promise of renewal. Frank knew better. Some scars never truly healed. They simply became part of who you are. Chapter 5, Isolation. December descended upon Montana with brutal cold and heavy snowfall, mirroring the emotional climate that had engulfed the aftermath of Thanksgiving. Frank monitored the fallout with the detachment of a scientist observing an experiment, cataloging each development in his journal while adjusting his strategy accordingly. Damon Fletcher's world was crumbling precisely as Frank had orchestrated. Following the Thanksgiving incident, rumors of Damon's financial difficulties spread through Billings' business community, fueled by strategic information Frank fed to key contacts. 2 major projects were now on indefinite hold as investors demanded audits and reassurances. More damaging than the business troubles was the social ostracism. Damon's reputation, once sterling in local circles, was tarnished by the domestic incident and the exposed affair with yet another woman. Invitations dried up. Business associates found reasons to cancel meetings. His carefully curated image as a family man and community leader lay in ruins. Frank observed all this through his network of informants, feeling neither joy nor satisfaction, only the cool assessment that justice was being served, step by measured step. Nora's situation evoked more complex emotions. After spending 2 weeks at her parents' home, she had moved back into the house she'd shared with Damon, though he was now staying at a hotel downtown. According to Theodore, she was devastated by the double betrayal. First learning of Damon's other relationship, then witnessing his true character emerge during their confrontation. Frank maintained his careful distance, interacting with Nora only regarding custody arrangements for Max. During these exchanges, he was unfailingly polite but distant, offering no emotional support or opportunity for Nora to process her pain with him. This calculated withdrawal was deliberate, designed to isolate Nora further as her social circle contracted in the wake of the scandal. She asked about you, Theodore mentioned during one of his regular visits to spend time with Max, whether you knew about Damon's other involvement. What did you tell her? Frank asked, watching his son stack brightly colored blocks on the living room floor. The truth. that you seemed to have information but weren't gloating about it. Theodore studied Frank carefully. She's beginning to realize what she threw away. Frank nodded noncommittally. That's natural in times of crisis. People look back to what felt secure. Is there any chance, Frank, for reconciliation? Hope tinged the older man's voice. No. Frank's response was gentle but absolute. That chapter is closed. As Christmas approached, Frank accelerated the next phase of his plan. Through shell companies, he acquired controlling interest in the bank holding the mortgages on two of Damon's struggling development properties. Simultaneously, he arranged for damaging information about permit irregularities to reach city officials, triggering reviews that further delayed construction and increased carrying costs. On December 20th, Frank received a surprising call from Nora. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice strained. "Not about Max. About us. About everything." Frank considered his options. This conversation was inevitable, but the timing had to serve as larger strategy. "I'm leaving tomorrow for a job in Denver," he replied, which was true, a legitimate security contract that would keep him away through Christmas. "I'll be back the day after Christmas. We can talk then." "Frank, please. I'm drowning here." The desperation in her voice was palpable. "We all make choices, Nora," he said evenly. "Sometimes we have to live with them longer than we'd like." After hanging up, Frank contacted Leanne, who had become an unwitting but effective ally in his campaign against Damon. Through her legal battles with her ex-husband, she had gained access to financial information that proved invaluable. "The River Ridge project is about to go under," she reported with vindictive satisfaction. "Damon's trying to secure emergency financing, but no one's touching it. Not after what happened at Thanksgiving." "What about his relationship with Claire?" Frank asked, referring to the other woman whose existence his gift had exposed. "Over. Apparently she didn't sign up for all this drama." Leanne paused. "Frank, there's something else. Damon's been asking questions about you. About your business, your contacts. I think he's trying to figure out how you knew what you knew." "Let him wonder," Frank replied calmly, though he made a mental note to increase security protocols. Damon Fletcher was a wounded animal now, less powerful but potentially more dangerous. The Denver assignment provided Frank with welcome distance during the Christmas period, while Nora spent the holiday with her parents and Max, an arrangement Frank had generously suggested. He used the time to finalize preparations for January, when the pressure would intensify significantly. Frank returned to Montana on December 26th to find three developments waiting for him. First, Damon Fletcher had received notice that loans on two key properties were being called due following repeated covenant violations. Second, the city of Billings had issued stop work orders on his downtown renovation project, pending investigation of structural concerns. The third development was more personal. Nora had left 6 increasingly desperate voicemails, culminating in an emotional Christmas Day message where she admitted making the biggest mistake of my life and begged for a chance to talk. Frank arranged to meet her the following day at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of Billings where they were unlikely to encounter mutual acquaintances. He arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. Nora appeared exactly on time, her face pale but composed. She had lost weight, Frank noted, and the confident posture she had always maintained was diminished, shoulders slightly hunched as if bearing an invisible burden. "Thank you for meeting me," she began after ordering a cappuccino she would barely touch. "I know you probably hate me." "I don't hate you," Frank replied truthfully. Hate required emotional investment he no longer chose to make where Nora was concerned. "I've moved beyond that." Hope flickered briefly in her eyes. "Then maybe we can." "No." Frank's interruption was gentle but firm. "If you're suggesting reconciliation, the answer is no. That's not why I agreed to meet." The hope disappeared, replaced by resignation. "I understand. I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. The affair, the lies, trying to make you the villain in our story to justify what I did." Frank studied her, noting the genuine remorse in her expression. 6 months ago, it might have moved him. Now, it's simply registered as data, another expected development in his calculated sequence. "I appreciate the apology," he said neutrally. Is that all you wanted to discuss? Tears welled in Nora's eyes. What happened to you, Frank? You were always steady, always strong, but never this cold. People change when their foundations are destroyed. Frank sipped his coffee. You and Damon taught me valuable lessons about trust and consequences. I'm simply applying what I learned. Is that what all this is about? Consequences? A flash of the old Nora emerged, perceptive, incisive. The timing of everything that's happened to Damon since Thanksgiving. That's not coincidence, is it? Frank neither confirmed nor denied. Life has a way of balancing accounts eventually. He thinks you're behind his problems. He's becoming obsessed with proving it. That sounds like another poor decision on his part, Frank observed. Focusing on blame rather than solutions. Nora leaned forward. He's dangerous, Frank. I've seen sides of him I never knew existed. The way he reacted when he opened your gift. She shuddered visibly. Be careful. Frank nodded, accepting the warning at face value. I always am. Which brings me to why I agreed to meet. I'm filing for full custody of Max. The statement hit Nora like a physical blow. What? Why? I've never been anything but a good mother. You brought a volatile, potentially violent man into our son's life, Frank pointed out evenly. A man who's now facing financial ruin and possible legal troubles. The environment isn't stable or safe. That's not fair. I've ended things with Damon completely. He's not in our lives anymore. The damage is done, Nora. My attorney will be contacting yours tomorrow. Nora's composure cracked entirely, tears flowing freely now. Please don't do this. Max is all I have left. You'll still have visitation rights, Frank assured her, his voice softening slightly despite himself. This isn't about punishing you. It's about Max's well-being. It was, of course, about both, protecting Max while simultaneously applying the most painful pressure point possible on Nora. Frank had consulted multiple child psychology experts and determined that the custody modification was indeed in Max's best interest given the circumstances, but he was under no illusions about the dual purpose it served in his larger strategy. After Nora left the coffee shop, Frank remained, reviewing the encounter in his mind. Her warning about Damon couldn't be dismissed. The man was desperate, facing professional and personal collapse, and clearly suspicious of Frank's role in his downfall. Frank made 2 calls before leaving. The first was to Vince, requesting enhanced security measures at both the guest house and Nora's residence. The second was to Theodore Reynolds, asking him to stay with Nora for the next few days under the pretext of helping with Max. That evening, Frank received confirmation that the final pieces were falling into place. The bank was formally initiating foreclosure proceedings on Damon's flagship development. The city council was scheduling public hearings about permit irregularities. Most satisfyingly, 3 former business associates had filed civil suits alleging misrepresentation and financial misconduct. As January approached, Frank felt the steady progress of his plan with cool satisfaction. Damon Fletcher was being systematically destroyed, professionally, financially, socially. Nora was experiencing the isolation and loss that came with poor choices and their consequences. The only wild card now was Damon himself, how he would react as the walls closed incompletely. Frank had contingencies prepared, but he knew from military experience that desperate adversaries were unpredictable. The endgame would require perfect execution and constant vigilance. In his journal that night, Frank wrote, Phase 2 nearing completion. Financially compromised, socially isolated, legally vulnerable, and emotionally destabilized, beginning to fully comprehend consequences. Custody filing will accelerate psychological impact. Primary concerns, D's potential for desperate action, maintaining Max's emotional well-being throughout. Thanksgiving was the opening salvo. The final resolution approaches. Outside, the Montana winter raged on, harsh and unforgiving, much like the justice Frank was delivering to those who had betrayed him. Chapter 6, Retribution. January brought record-breaking cold to Montana, the kind of bone-chilling freeze that seemed to crystallize time itself. For Frank, the frigid conditions were fitting accompaniment to the coldly calculated final phases of his plan. The custody filing had the intended effect. Nora was devastated, her already fragile emotional state further destabilized by the prospect of losing primary care of Max. Her parents tried to mediate, suggesting a less adversarial approach, but Frank remained resolute. "The court will determine what's best for Max," he told Theodore during one of their regular conversations. "I'm simply ensuring all relevant factors are considered." Those relevant factors included meticulously documented evidence of Damon's volatile behavior, the unstable home environment following the Thanksgiving incident, and expert testimony from child development specialists regarding consistency and security for children Max's age. Frank's military extended to legal strategy, leaving nothing to chance. Meanwhile, Damon Fletcher's downward spiral accelerated dramatically. The foreclosure proceedings on his properties had become public knowledge, spawning a cascade of negative press coverage that highlighted the permit irregularities Frank had arranged to expose. Former business partners distanced themselves completely, several filing their own lawsuits to protect their investments. By mid-January, Damon's desperation manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. He was cited for public intoxication outside a downtown bar, then involved in a shouting match with city officials during a public hearing. Each incident was dutifully reported by local media, further cementing his fall from grace. Frank monitored these developments with detached interest, adjusting his security protocols as Damon's behavior grew more unpredictable. The security cameras around a guest house were upgraded, and Vince assigned a rotating team to maintain surveillance on both properties. "He's spiraling," Vince reported during their weekly strategy session. "Last night, he was at the Broken Spoke, drunk before 9, telling anyone who'd listen that he's been set up." "Is he mentioning me specifically?" Frank asked, reviewing the surveillance photos. "Not by name, but he's ranting about conspiracies. It's only a matter of time before he connects the dots more explicitly." Frank nodded. "Increased security at Nora's place. Whatever our differences, I don't want Max or her at risk." The custody proceedings moved forward with deliberate speed, accelerated by Frank's connections within the legal system. A temporary order granted him primary custody pending the final hearing, with Nora receiving supervised visitation 3 days a week, a schedule that kept her tethered to Billings despite her expressed desire to make a fresh start elsewhere. Throughout this period, Frank maintained his carefully constructed facade of the reasonable ex-husband concerned only with his son's welfare. He facilitated Nora's visitation without conflict, exchanged polite conversation during handoffs, and even agreed to Theodore and Martha's request for family dinner with Max, Nora, and themselves. During these carefully orchestrated interactions, Frank observed Nora's deterioration with clinical detachment. The confident, vivacious woman he had married was diminished, anxiety evident in her every gesture. Her once successful career as an event coordinator had stalled following the scandal, leaving her financially dependent on her parents as legal fees mounted. "You've won, Frank," she said quietly during one custody exchange in late January. "Isn't that enough?" "This isn't about winning," he replied, his voice neither cruel nor kind. "It's about consequences, about responsibility. When does it end?" Tears welled in her eyes. "When have we paid enough?" Frank met her gaze steadily. "That's not for me to determine. Life has its own arithmetic." The situation reached its critical point faster than even Frank had anticipated. On January 29th, Damon Fletcher, facing criminal charges related to the permit irregularities and civil suits from multiple investors, made his desperate move. Frank was working in his home office when the security system alerted him to an unauthorized entry attempt at the main property gate. The camera footage showed Damon's luxury sedan, now dusty and dented, trying to force the electronic gate. When that failed, Damon abandoned the vehicle and proceeded on foot, visibly intoxicated and carrying something in his right hand. Frank immediately activated emergency protocols, notifying both the security team and local law enforcement. Then he retrieved his licensed firearm from the safe and positioned himself strategically, maintaining visual contact with the approaching threat through security feeds. Damon's progress across the property was erratic, his movements suggesting both intoxication and emotional instability. As he neared the guest house, the object in his hand became identifiable. A handgun, gripped inexpertly but unmistakably dangerous. "Coming for you, Harlow," Damon shouted, his voice carrying across the snow-covered grounds. "Think you're so smart. Think you've got it all figured out." Frank remained calm, speaking quietly into his phone to the 911 dispatcher, providing continuous updates on Damon's position and confirming the visible weapon. Years of security work had prepared him for precisely such situations. The difference being that this time, the threat was personally motivated rather than professional. When Damon reached the guest house porch, Frank strategically activated the external security lights, temporarily blinding the intruder. Damon's reaction was immediate and reckless. He fired 2 wild shots toward the house, both embedding harmlessly in the reinforced siding that Frank had installed months earlier. That gunfire proved to be Damon's final mistake. Local sheriff's deputies, already en route due to Frank's early warning, arrived with lights flashing but sirens silent, taking positions around the property. Within minutes, they had surrounded Damon, weapons drawn, ordering him to drop his gun. What followed was captured with perfect clarity by the security cameras, footage that would later prove invaluable in court proceedings. Damon, realizing he was surrounded, initially appeared ready to surrender. Then, in a final act of defiance, he raised his weapon toward the nearest deputy. The officers responded as their training dictated. 3 shots rang out, and Damon Fletcher collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, critically wounded but alive. Frank observed the entire sequence without emotion, his military training keeping him focused on immediate security concerns rather than the human drama unfolding. Only after Damon had been secured and transported to the hospital did Frank allow himself to process what had occurred. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Damon underwent emergency surgery for gunshot wounds to his shoulder and abdomen. He survived but faced multiple felony charges: attempted breaking and entering, illegal discharge of a firearm, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted assault on law enforcement officers. The media coverage was immediate and extensive, the dramatic armed confrontation at Frank Harlow's property dominating local headlines. Frank himself was portrayed sympathetically, the wronged ex-husband defending his home against an unhinged attacker with connections to his former wife. Nora, devastated by the incident, retreated further from public view, staying with her parents and seeing Max only during court-mandated visitation periods. According to Theodore, she was broken by the culmination of events, finally comprehending the full extent of her miscalculations in becoming involved with Damon. For Frank, the incident represented both validation of his strategic foresight and a transition point in his larger plan. With Damon effectively neutralized, facing years in prison once he recovered from his injuries, the focus shifted entirely to the final resolution with Nora. 2 weeks after the incident, with Damon still hospitalized under police guard, Frank invited Theodore and Martha Reynolds to the guest house for dinner. The conversation was cordial until Frank carefully steered it toward the subject of Max's future. "I've been thinking about what's best for him long-term," Frank said, pouring more wine for his former in-laws. "About stability and family connections." Martha looked hopeful. "We've been worried sick about that. With everything that's happened, I'm going to modify my custody petition," Frank continued, his tone measured. "I still believe Max should primarily be with me, but I'm open to more flexible arrangements regarding Nora's involvement." Theodore's relief was visible. "Frank, that's very generous considering everything." "Under certain conditions," Frank added, his expression serious. "Nora needs to complete counseling. She needs to demonstrate stability, financial and emotional. And she needs to truly understand the consequences of her choices." Of course, Martha agreed quickly. She already understands so much more than she did. This whole terrible business with Damon, the way you've been with Max throughout, it's been eye-opening for her. Frank nodded, satisfied with their response. "I'd like you to discuss it with her, not as an ultimatum, but as a pathway forward. For Max's sake." After they left, Frank sat alone in the guest house, reviewing the events of the past 9 months in his journal. What had begun as a response to betrayal had evolved into something more complex. A complete dismantling and reconstruction of the relationships and power dynamics that defined his family situation. Damon Fletcher had been systematically destroyed, professionally, financially, socially, and now legally. His reckless attack on Frank's property had been the final, self-destructive act in a downward spiral engineered. Nora had experienced the full weight of consequences, losing her relationship, her financial security, her social standing, and most painfully, her unfettered access to Max. She had been brought to a point of genuine recognition regarding her choices and their impacts. Frank himself had transformed through the process. The man who had once invested complete trust in his marriage was gone, replaced by someone more strategically minded, more aware of human weakness, less inclined toward forgiveness, but paradoxically more capable of calculated mercy when it served a greater purpose. In his journal, Frank wrote, Phase 3 complete, deneutralized permanently, and brought to full recognition of consequences. The final act approaches, not reconciliation, never that, but a recalibration of boundaries and expectations. The family is forever altered, but Max's well-being remains the constant objective. Everything else has been in service to that end and to justice. The Montana winter continued outside, but Frank sensed the approach of a metaphorical spring. Not a return to what was before, but the emergence of something new from the harsh season of retribution. Chapter 7. Illumination. February arrived with warming temperatures that gradually began melting Montana's snowpack, revealing the dormant landscape beneath. For Frank, this transition mirrored his own progression from the cold calculation of revenge to a more nuanced consideration of the future. Damon Fletcher remained hospitalized under guard, his condition stabilized, but his legal situation deteriorating daily. New charges emerged as investigators, prompted by the shooting incident, delved deeper into his business practices. What Frank had strategically exposed represented only the surface of Damon's misconduct. Beneath lay years of financial manipulation, investor deception, and regulatory violations that would ensure his imprisonment regardless of the outcome of the attempted assault charges. For Nora, the weeks following Damon's attack brought profound change. According to Theodore, she had begun intensive therapy, confronting not only the trauma of recent events, but deeper patterns that had led to her self-destructive choices. She had also started applying for jobs, seeking financial independence from her parents and stability for potential custody arrangements. Frank observed these developments with careful attention, noting in his journal the progression of what he termed recognition and realignment, Nora's growing understanding of her role in the sequence of events and her attempts to establish a new foundation for her life. On a crisp Saturday morning in mid-February, Theodore Reynolds called Frank with an unexpected request. "Nora wants to speak with you," he said, his voice reflecting both hope and trepidation. "Not about custody or legal matters. She says there are things you deserve to hear from her directly." Frank considered the timing. The custody hearing was scheduled for early March. Any conversation now would exist outside that formal process, potentially allowing for more authentic communication. "I'll meet with her," Frank agreed, "but on neutral ground." The coffee shop downtown. When Nora arrived at the appointed time, Frank immediately noted changes in her appearance. She seemed both diminished and somehow strengthened, thinner but standing straighter, with a clarity in her eyes that had been absent during their January meeting. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she began after they were seated. "I know you have every reason to refuse." Frank nodded, waiting silently for her to continue. "I've been doing a lot of work in therapy," Nora said, her voice steady despite evident nervousness. "About why I betrayed you. About the stories I told myself to justify it. About the damage I've caused to everyone, you, Max, my family." She paused, "Even to myself." "Understanding is important," Frank acknowledged, his tone neutral but not cold. "The thing is, Frank, I never stopped loving you." Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. "What I did with Damon wasn't about love. It was about, I don't know, excitement? Fear of what our life had become after Max." Some twisted need to sabotage what mattered most to me. Does the reason really matter now? Frank asked quietly. It matters to me, Nora replied. And I thought it might matter to you to know it wasn't because I stopped caring. It was because I was broken in ways I didn't understand. She wiped at her eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for reconciliation. I just needed you to know that what we had was real for me, even though I destroyed it. Frank studied her, searching for manipulation or calculation in her words, and finding none. For the first time since discovering her betrayal, he allowed himself to feel something beyond the strategic consideration of Nora as an element in his plans, a faint echo of the connection they had once shared. I believe you, he said finally, but understanding doesn't change what happened or its consequences. I know, Nora nodded, accepting this reality. I also know what you've done, Frank. Frank's expression remained carefully neutral. What I've done, to Damon, to his business, to me. Nora met his gaze directly. The timing was too perfect, the information too precise. I've had a lot of time to think about it all. You engineered his downfall completely. For a moment, Frank considered denial, but something in the clarity of Nora's perception deserved honesty in return. And if I did, then I understand, she said simply. Not just why, but how. It's who you've always been, thorough, 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I just never thought those qualities would be turned against me. They weren't meant for you, Frank clarified. You were collateral damage in what happened to Damon, though your choices put you in that position. Nora absorbed this, nodding slowly. Fair enough. What happens now, Frank? With Max? With us. Not as a couple, but as parents. That depends on you, Frank replied. I meant what I told your parents. I'm willing to consider more flexible arrangements if you demonstrate stability and understanding. And if I can't convince you, a flash of the old Nora emerged, direct, challenging. Then the court will decide. But I think you know which way that's likely to go given recent events. Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, moving beyond recrimination into practical considerations about Max's future and potential co-parenting arrangements. Frank found himself impressed by Nora's clarity and commitment to change, though he remained appropriately skeptical based on past experience. When they finally parted, something had shifted subtly between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first foundation of a new understanding based on hard-earned truth rather than the illusions of their previous relationship. As February progressed toward the March custody hearing, Frank monitored Nora's progress through various channels. She secured a position with a local marketing firm, established a modest apartment in a family-friendly neighborhood, and continued her therapy sessions with documented progress. Each step was noted in Frank's journal, but also with a gradual softening of his assessment. Theodore and Martha provided regular updates on Max's time with Nora, reporting positive interactions and Nora's focused attention on their son's needs. Frank cross-referenced these reports with his own observations of Max's behavior after visits, finding consistency that suggested genuine improvement in Nora's parenting approach. 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing, Frank received an unexpected visitor at the guest house, Winston Heath, his attorney, arriving unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. We need to talk about the custody case, Winston said after settling in Frank's living room. There have been developments. What kind of developments? Frank asked, immediately alert. Nora's attorney has submitted a proposed settlement agreement. Winston extracted a document from his briefcase. It's surprisingly reasonable. Joint legal custody. Physical custody divided 60/40ths in your favor. Structured holiday arrangements. Provisions for regular evaluation and adjustment as Max grows older. Frank reviewed the document carefully, noting the concessions Nora had offered and the protection she sought. The proposal aligned closely with what he had privately determined would be optimal for Max's well-being while maintaining his primary influence over his son's upbringing. What's your assessment? Frank asked his attorney. Honestly, it's better than what we'd likely get from a judge. Winston had been practicing family law for 30 years and rarely sugarcoated his opinions. Given Nora's recent stability and the documented improvements in her situation, the court would likely award something close to 50/50ths. This gives you the advantage while still being fair enough that she can present it as her choice rather than her defeat. Frank considered the strategic implications. And she offered this voluntarily? According to her attorney, yes. Said she wanted to prioritize Max's stability over winning more time. Winston studied Frank carefully. It's a good deal, Frank. Better than good, actually. The question is why she's offering it. Frank had his suspicions but kept them to himself. I'll consider it and let you know my decision. After Winston departed, Frank spent the evening reviewing the proposal line by line, comparing it against his own ideal scenario for Max's future. The agreement Nora had offered served Max's best interests while acknowledging Frank's position as the more stable parent. It was, as Winston had stated, better than what a court would likely mandate. More intriguing was what the offer revealed about Nora's evolution. The woman who had initially fought against any change to their custody arrangement was now voluntarily ceding primary physical custody to Frank. The implications, both practical and psychological, were significant. The next morning, Frank called Theodore Reynolds. "Did you know about Nora's settlement offer?" he asked directly. "Yes," Theodore admitted. "She discussed it with us before instructing her attorney, Martha, and I thought it showed real growth on her part." "What's her angle, Theodore?" "There has to be one." The older man sighed. "Not everything has an angle, Frank. Sometimes people just recognize reality and try to make the best of it." After a pause, he added, "She knows she hurt you irreparably. She knows she's lucky to have any relationship with Max after what happened. This is her trying to build something workable from the ashes without causing him more pain." Frank thanked Theodore for his insight and spent the next 2 days carefully considering his response. His journal entries during this period revealed a shift in his thinking. N's offer presents optimal practical outcome while satisfying strategic objectives. Maximum stability for Max, maintenance of primary influence, recognition from N of consequences, and altered power dynamic. Question remains whether acceptance constitutes sufficient resolution or premature conclusion to accountability process. On the third day, Frank contacted Winston and instructed him to accept the proposal with minor modifications that clarified financial responsibilities and decision-making protocols, changes that strengthened the agreement without altering its fundamental balance. Nora accepted these modifications without objection. 1 week later, they met at Winston's office to sign the agreement, which would be submitted to the court for approval in lieu of the contested hearing. As they completed the signing process, Nora looked across the conference table at Frank. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being willing to work with me instead of against me. For Max's sake." Frank studied her expression, searching for manipulation and finding none. "This arrangement serves his best interests. That's always been my priority." "I know." Nora hesitated, then asked, "Will there ever be a point where we've moved beyond what happened? Not back to what we were. I know that's impossible, but to something that isn't defined by my betrayal in your—" She trailed off. "My response to it?" Frank suggested. "Yes." Frank considered the question seriously. "Time will tell. We're parents to the same child. That connection doesn't end, regardless of what happened between us." It wasn't forgiveness. Frank wasn't certain he was capable of that. But it was acknowledgement of a future that required continued interaction and potential evolution. For now, that was the most he could offer. As February gave way to March, the formal custody agreement was approved by the court, establishing the new framework for Max's upbringing. Frank began the process of returning to the main house while maintaining the guest house as an occasional retreat and home office. Damon Fletcher, meanwhile, had been transferred from the hospital to jail, facing multiple criminal charges with preliminary hearings scheduled for late spring. According to law enforcement contacts, he had become increasingly unstable, alternating between depression and rage as the full consequences of his actions became apparent. Frank noted these developments with the detachment of someone observing the inevitable outcome of natural forces, the gravitational pull of consequences responding to the mass of poor decisions. His focus had shifted almost entirely to establishing the new normal for himself and Max, with Nora now recategorized in his mental framework from target to co-parent with probationary status. In his journal, Frank wrote, Phase complete. Primary objectives achieved. D removed as threat. Improperly positioned in new family structure with appropriate boundaries and expectations. Max secured in stable environment with maximum protection. Secondary objectives partially achieved. Full accountability recognition from N appears genuine, but requires ongoing verification through consistent action over time. As spring began tentatively emerging across Montana, Frank sensed a corresponding thaw in the frozen landscape of his emotional life. Not a return to vulnerability, never that again, but perhaps the first recognition that existence beyond strategic calculation remained possible. Max, now approaching 18 months old and developing rapidly, became the center of this emerging perspective. Watching his son discover the world with joy and curiosity reminded Frank of what remained valuable beyond justice and consequences. The old Frank Harlow had died with the discovery of Nora's betrayal. A new version had emerged through the crucible of calculated retribution. Now, with primary objectives achieved, this evolved Frank faced the greatest challenge of all, defining who he would be in the aftermath of necessary destruction. Chapter 8. Convergence. March blossomed into April, bringing with it the renewal that inevitably follows even the harshest Montana winter. Frank observed this transition from the deck of the main house, which he had fully reclaimed and subtly transformed. New furniture, different paint colors, rearranged spaces, all served to exorcise memories of a life that had existed before, while creating an environment focused entirely on his and Max's needs. The custody arrangement with Nora had stabilized into a functional routine. 3 days each week, Max stayed with his mother at her new apartment, returning to Frank for the remaining 4 days. The transitions were handled with professional courtesy, their interactions focused exclusively on Max's well-being rather than their complicated past. Frank monitored these developments with the same attention he applied to all aspects of his life, noting patterns and potential concerns in his journal. Nora continued her therapy, maintained her new job with apparent success, and by all observable metrics remained committed to her role as a responsible co-parent. What Frank had not anticipated was his own gradual evolution. The cold calculation that had driven his campaign against Damon and Nora remained a core component of his personality, but it had been joined by something less tactical, a measured re-engagement with life beyond strategic objectives. This shift became apparent during a conversation with Vince on a warm April evening as they reviewed the security business's quarterly performance. "We've been approached about expanding the Diplomatic Protection Division," Vince reported, scrolling through projections on his tablet. "The State Department contract opens doors to similar arrangements with 3 allied nations. It's significant growth potential." 5 months earlier, Frank would have automatically evaluated such an opportunity purely through the lens of his revenge strategy, how it might impact his resources or timeline for targeting Damon and Nora. Now, he found himself genuinely considering the business implications and opportunities. "Let's pursue it," Frank decided, "but I want to maintain our quality standards. Controlled expansion, not rapid scaling." Vince studied him curiously. "You seem different lately. More present." Frank raised an eyebrow. As opposed to the human chess master who's been 3 moves ahead of everyone since last summer. Vince set down his tablet. "Don't get me wrong. That version of you was impressive as hell. Terrifying, but impressive. But this version seems more balanced." Frank considered this assessment. The objectives were achieved. Continuing to operate at that level of strategic intensity would be unnecessary and unhealthy, Vince added quietly. "You know, I supported you through all of it. Damon deserved everything he got, and then some. But I worried about what it was doing to you." "I'm fine," Frank replied automatically. "Are you? Really?" Vince's concern was evident, because there's a difference between surviving something and truly living again afterward. The conversation lingered in Frank's thoughts long after Vince departed. That night, his journal entry reflected an unusual level of self-examination. These observation requires consideration. Strategic focus served its purpose, but may have become habitual rather than necessary. Max deserves a father capable of full engagement, not merely tactical parenting. Question remains whether recalibration is possible or desirable after fundamental trust structures have been compromised. As April progressed, Frank found himself deliberately testing the boundaries of his emotional re-engagement. He accepted a dinner invitation from Theodore and Martha Reynolds, without Max as buffer, and discovered he could interact with them comfortably despite their connection to Nora. He resumed occasional social activities with trusted contacts outside his security work. Most significantly, he began allowing himself to experience moments of genuine joy with Max, rather than filtering every interaction through the lens of strategic parenting. Meanwhile, the consequences of his campaign against Damon Fletcher continued unfolding. The preliminary hearings had established overwhelming evidence for multiple felony charges, leading Damon's attorney to initiate plea agreement discussions. Financial investigations had uncovered extensive fraud dating back years, ensuring that even with a favorable plea deal, Damon faced substantial prison time. Frank received regular updates on these developments through law enforcement contacts, noting them with clinical detachment rather than satisfaction. The revenge that had consumed him for months now seemed less important than building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. In late April, Nora requested a meeting outside their regular custody exchanges. They met at a local park where Max could play on the swings while they talked, the child's presence serving as both buffer and reminder of their permanent connection. "I wanted to discuss the summer schedule," Nora began, her manner professional but not cold. "I know the agreement gives you priority for planning vacations, but I was hoping we might coordinate." Frank listened as she outlined her modest proposal. A week at her parents' cabin on Flathead Lake in July, a time traditionally reserved for family gatherings that would benefit Max through connection with cousins and grandparents. "That's reasonable," Frank agreed, noting how differently they now negotiated compared to the adversarial posturing of months earlier. "I was planning to take him to Yellowstone in August anyway." Nora nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you. I'm trying to make this work, Frank. Really trying." "I've noticed," he acknowledged, surprising them both with the admission. They watched Max for a few moments, his enthusiastic attempts at climbing bringing smiles to both their faces. "He's getting so big," Nora observed. "Sometimes I look at him and can't believe how much I almost lost through my stupid choices." Frank studied her expression, finding genuine regret rather than manipulation. "But you didn't lose him." "Not completely. Thanks to your restraint," Nora said quietly. "You could have pushed for full custody. Your attorney, your evidence, what happened with Damon. You would have one. We both know that." "It wouldn't have been best for Max," Frank replied simply. "The old Frank would have said that," Nora acknowledged. "But the man you became after everything? I wasn't sure what he would prioritize." The observation was perceptive enough to merit a truthful response. "Neither was I, for a while." This modest exchange represented the most personal conversation they had shared since the dissolution of their marriage. Frank noted its significance while maintaining appropriate boundaries, recognizing that functional co-parenting required a baseline of mutual understanding without implying forgiveness or reconciliation. In early May, as spring fully established itself across Montana, Frank received news that provided unexpected closure to a significant chapter of the past year. Damon Fletcher had accepted a plea agreement, admitting to multiple financial crimes and the assault charges stemming from his armed confrontation at Frank's property. The sentence was substantial, 12 years with possibility of parole after 8, plus restitution to defrauded investors. Frank learned of this development not through his law enforcement contacts, but from Leanne, who called him directly after receiving notification from the prosecutor's office. "It's finally over," she said, her voice carrying the weight of complex emotions. 12 years. "How do you feel about it?" Frank asked. "Relieved, sad, angry it came to this." Leanne paused. "Grateful to you, in a way, though I know that's complicated." Frank had maintained a carefully distanced friendship with Leanne in recent months, stepping back from the quasi-romantic relationship he had strategically encouraged during his campaign against Damon. She had understood the transition, recognizing that their connection had been rooted more in mutual grievance than genuine compatibility. "We all made choices," Frank responded carefully. "Damon's finally facing the consequences of his." "As did I," Leanne acknowledged. "As did Nora. As did you, Frank." After the call, Frank reflected on the significance of this resolution. Damon Fletcher, the catalyst for the destruction of 2 marriages and the architect of his own downfall, was effectively removed from the equation permanently. The practical threat he had posed was neutralized, but so too was his utility as a focus for Frank's retribution. That evening, Frank wrote in his journal, "D. Sentencing represents formal conclusion to primary conflict sequence initiated 11 months ago. Appropriate justice achieved through combination of strategic intervention and D's self-destructive responses to pressure. Final assessment. D will never again pose threat to M or family structure. Secondary consideration. With primary adversary neutralized, continued tactical positioning regarding N requires reevaluation. Objective now centers on optimal co-parenting functionality rather than neutralization of threats or administration of consequences." This entry reflected Frank's evolving perspective, a shift from revenge as driving force to the more nuanced complexity of building a functional future that prioritized Max's well-being while maintaining appropriate boundaries with Nora. The following week brought another significant development when Theodore Reynolds invited Frank to lunch at his club in downtown Billings. The setting, an old-fashioned establishment frequented by Montana's business elite, suggested the conversation would extend beyond casual family matters. "I've been thinking about the future," Theodore began after they had ordered. "About Max, about Nora, about you." Frank nodded, allowing the older man to direct the conversation. "Nora's making genuine progress," Theodore continued. "Martha and I have seen real change in her. Not just behavior, but understanding. The therapy, the way she's reorganized her priorities, it's substantial. I've noticed," Frank acknowledged. "The custody arrangement seems to be working effectively." Theodore studied Frank carefully. "What about you, son? Are you finding your way forward or still looking backward?" The directness of the question caught Frank by surprise. Theodore had always been perceptive, but rarely so confrontational. "I'm focused on Max," Frank replied after a moment. "On rebuilding our business, on creating stability. All good things." Theodore leaned forward. "But they're external objectives. I'm asking about you, the man behind the strategies and plans." Frank considered deflecting, but found himself responding honestly. "The man I was before died when I discovered Nora's betrayal. The man I became afterward served a purpose that's now largely fulfilled. Who I am now is still evolving." Theodore nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. "That's more insight than I expected, frankly. The Frank of 6 months ago wouldn't have acknowledged the transformation at all." "Why are you asking, Theodore?" The older man sighed. "Because I care about all of you, Nora, and especially Max. This terrible chapter has cost everyone dearly. Nora lost what could have been a lifetime of happiness with a good man. You lost the family you thought you had. Max nearly lost the stability every child deserves. Your point being? My point is that while the past can't be undone, the future isn't written yet." Theodore's expression was earnest. "Healing is possible, not reconciliation. I understand that bridge is burned, but perhaps something beyond cold co-parenting for Max's sake." Frank studied Theodore thoughtfully. "Have you discussed this perspective with Nora?" "Yes. She's under no illusions about reconciliation either. But she hopes for, I suppose forgiveness is too strong a word." "Much too strong," Frank confirmed. "Understanding, then. Mutual respect. A relationship that doesn't carry the weight of perpetual punishment." Frank considered this carefully. "Consequences aren't punishment, Theodore. They're the natural result of actions. What Nora wants is to escape the ongoing consequences of her choices." "Perhaps initially," Theodore conceded, "but I believe she's moved beyond that now. What she's seeking is permission to rebuild herself without constant reminder of her worst mistakes." The conversation continued through lunch. Theodore making his case with a persuasive skill that had served him well in business negotiations throughout his career. Frank listened without committing to any change in his approach, but he found himself genuinely considering the perspective being offered. After parting from Theodore, Frank spent the afternoon hiking in the foothills outside Billings, Max secured in a carrier on his back. The physical exertion and solitude provided space for reflection that had been increasingly necessary as his rigid focus on revenge gave way to more complex considerations of the future. What emerged from this reflection was recognition that the most challenging aspect of his transformation lay ahead. The strategic dismantling of Damon Fletcher and the recalibration of Nora's role in Max's life had been, in many ways, the easier tasks. They had required patience and tactical thinking, all strengths Frank possessed in abundance. What remained? Defining who he would become in the aftermath and how much of his humanity he would reclaim from the cold strategist he had become was far less amenable to planning. In the weeks that followed, Frank found himself making incremental adjustments to his interactions with Nora. Nothing dramatic, no declarations of forgiveness or sudden warmth, but small acknowledgments of her consistent efforts. He agreed to occasional family dinners with her parents when Max was transitioning between households. He shared more information about Max's development and experiences during his time at the main house. He responded to her text messages about co-parenting matters with less clinical detachment. None of these adjustments signaled forgiveness for her betrayal or a return of trust. Frank remained vigilant, continuing to verify her consistency through observation and his network of contacts. But they represented recognition that perpetual emotional warfare served neither Max's interests nor, increasingly, his own psychological well-being. By early June, these small shifts had accumulated into a noticeably different dynamic between them. During one custody exchange, as Max excitedly showed Nora a picture he had painted with Frank's help, she looked up with genuine emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for this, but for everything these past months. For being fair when you could have destroyed me completely. For allowing me to remain Max's mother when you had every reason to push me out." Frank studied her, noting the authenticity in her expression. Max needs his mother. A good mother. You're becoming that again. It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement of progress, the most he could honestly offer and more than she had expected. The spring thaw had brought renewal to Montana's landscape. A corresponding thaw was gradually occurring within Frank. Not a return to who he had been, but an integration of the strategic clarity he had developed through adversity with the capacity for connection that had defined him before betrayal rewrote his understanding of trust. In his journal that night, Frank wrote, "Integration rather than compartmentalization represents the optimal path forward. The strategic clarity remains essential, but not to the exclusion of selective reconnection. T's perspective merits consideration, not because it benefits N, but because continued focus on past injuries diminishes future potential. Justice has been served. Consequences have been administered. What remains is reconstruction, not of what was lost, but of something new that incorporates hard-earned wisdom without sacrificing capacity for measured engagement with life beyond tactical objectives." Outside, a summer thunderstorm rolled across the Montana sky. Powerful but cleansing, nature's way of balancing accounts and creating space for new growth in its wake. Chapter 9. Culmination. The summer solstice arrived in Montana with extended daylight that stretched the days toward infinity. Frank stood on the deck of the main house, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant orange and gold nearly 16 hours after dawn had broken over the eastern horizon. A year had passed since the discovery of Nora's betrayal, a year that had transformed him and everyone connected to him in ways none could have anticipated. As he observed the solstice light gradually yielding to dusk, Frank reflected on the symmetry of ending where he had begun, standing on his property, surveying what he had built, but now with profoundly different understanding. Max, now approaching 2 years old, played in a safe area of the deck, his vocabulary expanding daily, his personality emerging with increasing clarity. Watching his son, Frank felt the quiet satisfaction of having protected what mattered most through the turbulence of the past year. The custody arrangement with Nora had stabilized into a functional system that served Max's needs while respecting the new boundaries between his parents. Frank had maintained his position as primary custodian, but had gradually allowed more flexibility in scheduling as Nora demonstrated consistent reliability and proper priorities. Their interactions had evolved beyond the cold formality of early co-parenting into something that, while never warm, carried a measure of mutual respect. Frank recognized Nora's genuine efforts toward redemption without surrendering his fundamental conviction that trust, once broken so completely, could never be fully restored. Damon Fletcher remained incarcerated, his legal appeals exhausted, his business empire dismantled, his reputation permanently destroyed. Frank monitored these developments with diminishing interest, having recategorized Damon from active threat to historical footnote in the narrative of his life. More significant was Frank's internal evolution over the preceding months. The cold, calculating strategist who had systematically orchestrated Damon's downfall and Nora's recalibration still existed within him. That capacity for ruthless execution when threatened would never again lie dormant. But it had been reintegrated with other aspects of his personality that allowed for measured connection and selective trust. This integration was evident in all areas of his life. The security business had expanded thoughtfully under his and Vince's guidance, now including the diplomatic protection contracts that opened new international opportunities. Frank's relationship with Theodore and Martha Reynolds had evolved into a respectful partnership centered around Max's well-being rather than the painful history with Nora. Even his personal life had seen careful expansion, with occasional social engagements and a widening circle of trusted contacts. As June gave way to July, Frank prepared for the first significant test of the new family dynamic. Following their earlier agreement, Max would spend a week at Theodore and Martha's cabin on Flathead Lake, a family gathering that would include Nora and various extended family members. Frank would not attend, maintaining appropriate separation, but he had agreed to the arrangement despite the extended time Max would spend in Nora's care. The day before Max's departure, Frank received an unexpected call from Leanne Fletcher, whom he hadn't spoken with in several months. "I thought you should know," she began without preamble. Damon signed the final divorce settlement from prison. "Everything's officially resolved." "That's good news," Frank replied. "Closure is important." "Yes." Leanne paused. "I'm moving to Seattle next month. Fresh start, new job, clean break from everything here." "I wish you well," Frank said sincerely. "You deserve that fresh start. Before I go, I want to thank you." Her voice carried complicated emotions. "What you did, I know it was primarily about justice for yourself, but it brought justice for me too. Damon would have walked away from our marriage with everything while I was left shattered. Instead, he's facing consequences for all his choices." Frank considered his response carefully. "We all faced consequences this past year. Some deserved, some collateral. I'm glad you're finding your way forward." After ending the call, Frank reflected on Leanne's imminent departure from Montana. Another thread in the complex tapestry of the past year's events was being resolved, another character in the drama moving toward closure. It reinforced his sense that a chapter was ending, making space for whatever came next. The week of Max's absence provided Frank with unaccustomed solitude and time for deeper reflection. He used part of this period for practical matters, reviewing business operations, meeting with clients, addressing property maintenance that was easier without a toddler present. But he also allocated time for personal assessment, meticulously reviewing his journal entries from the past year to trace the arc of his transformation. What emerged from this review was recognition of both the necessity and the cost of the path he had chosen. The systematic dismantling of Damon Fletcher and the recalibration of Nora's position had achieved justice as Frank defined it, protecting Max's future and ensuring appropriate consequences for betrayal. Yet the process had required him to access and develop aspects of himself that, while effective, carried their own price in terms of emotional capacity and connection. On the fourth day of Max's absence, Frank received a text message from Nora with attached photographs of their son enjoying the lake with his grandparents. The images showed Max laughing in shallow water, helping Theodore build a sandcastle, sleeping peacefully in a hammock on the cabin's porch. "He's having a wonderful time," Nora's message read. "Misses his dad, but doing great. We're keeping to all his routines." Frank studied the photographs, noting details that confirmed Nora's careful attention to Max's needs. The life vest properly secured during water play, the sun protection, the familiar comfort objects visible in the hammock scene. A year earlier, such observations would have been purely tactical, assessed for compliance rather than caring. Now, Frank allowed himself to recognize the genuine maternal love evident in these small but significant details. His response maintained appropriate boundaries while acknowledging her efforts. "Thanks for the update. He looks happy. Keep following the sunscreen schedule. He burns easily." This modest exchange represented the new equilibrium they had established. Functional co-parenting without pretense of friendship or complete forgiveness, but also without the cold calculation that had characterized earlier interactions. When Max returned from the lake trip, bright with new experiences and excited to share them with his father, Frank observed subtle but positive developments in his son's comfort with transitions between households. The consistency of care and lack of conflict between his parents, however formally maintained, was serving Max's emotional security. In early August, as planned, Frank took Max to Yellowstone for a father-son adventure scaled appropriately for a 2-year-old. They stayed in a comfortable cabin, took short hikes to accessible natural features, and spent evenings on their private porch observing wildlife from a safe distance. Throughout the trip, Frank documented Max's reactions and experiences, creating memories that would form the foundation for a tradition of annual national park explorations as Max grew older. Upon their return to Billings, Frank made a decision that symbolized his evolving perspective. After 18 months of maintaining the guest house as his primary residence while using the main house primarily for Max's benefit, he completed the transition back to the main property, integrating his personal spaces with the family areas in a configuration that acknowledged their new reality as a different kind of family unit. This physical transition paralleled an internal one. Frank's recognition that maintaining artificial separation between the strategic thinker who had orchestrated consequences and the father building a future for his son was no longer necessary or beneficial. Integration rather than compartmentalization had become his guiding principle. In late August, as summer began yielding to early signs of autumn, Frank received a letter from Damon Fletcher, his first direct communication since the violent confrontation at the property. Prison regulations had required the letter to pass through multiple screening processes, ensuring it contained nothing threatening or inappropriate. Frank considered discarding it unread, but ultimately decided knowledge was preferable to ignorance, regardless of the source. The letter was brief, written in the unsteady hand of a man whose arrogance had been replaced by the harsh reality of consequences. "Harlow, I know you engineered everything that happened to me. Don't know how you did it, but I know it was you behind it all. Could have been anyone else, and I'd respect the strategic brilliance. But it was you, so all I feel is hate. Doesn't matter now. I've lost everything. Business gone. Freedom gone. Reputation destroyed. 12 years to think about how one bad choice cascaded into complete destruction. Write this not to apologize. We're way past that. But to acknowledge you won completely. Chess master took down the checkers player, just like Nora always said about you. Don't expect response. Just wanted you to know I see the full picture now. Too late to matter. Damon." Frank read the letter twice, noting the absence of threats or grandiose promises of future retribution. What remained of Damon Fletcher was simply a defeated man acknowledging the completeness of his downfall. Frank filed the letter in his records without responding, considering the matter closed with a finality that required no further action or emotion. September brought the formal end of summer and the beginning of a new phase in Max's development as he started part-time preschool, 2 mornings each week. Frank and Nora had selected the program together, another example of their evolving capacity for functional co-parenting despite the history between them. On the evening after Max's first day of preschool, Frank invited Theodore and Martha Reynolds to dinner at the main house to celebrate this milestone. The gathering was pleasant, if not warm, focused on Max's experience and future educational path, rather than the complicated adult relationships surrounding him. As Theodore and Martha prepared to leave, Martha embraced Frank briefly, the first such contact since the early days of his separation from Nora. "You've done well by Max through all of this," she said quietly. "Better than most men would have in your position." Frank nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without false modesty. He deserves nothing less. Theodore lingered after Martha had gone to the car, his expression thoughtful. "A year ago, I wasn't sure any of us would reach this point, sharing a civil meal, focusing on Max's future rather than past injuries. You've shown remarkable restraint, Frank." "Not initially," Frank acknowledged, remembering the cold calculation that had driven him through the early phases of his response to betrayal. "Perhaps not, but you found your way to balance eventually." Theodore clasped Frank's shoulder. "That's more than many achieve after what you experienced." After they departed, Frank spent the evening reviewing the most recent entries in his journal, noting the evolution in his perspective over the preceding months. The tactical and strategic focus remained, but they were increasingly directed toward constructive objectives rather than retributive ones. In late September, as Montana's landscape transformed with autumn colors, Frank received an email from Winston Heath regarding a final legal matter related to Damon Fletcher. "Frank, thought you should know that all civil claims against Fletcher's estate have now been satisfied through liquidation of remaining assets. Your anonymous acquisition of key properties through shell entities has been formally completed without raising flags. Clean resolution with no remaining exposure. On personal note, rarely seen someone navigate such complex terrain with your precision. Remind me never to get on your bad side. All matters now formally closed. Let me know if you need anything further. Winston." This notification represented the final thread in the intricate tapestry Frank had woven to ensure appropriate consequences for Damon's betrayal. The properties Frank had strategically acquired would be held in his investment portfolio, eventually redeveloped to benefit the community while providing additional security for Max's future. As October arrived, bringing with it the anniversary of when Frank's plan had shifted into active implementation, he scheduled a dinner meeting with Vince. Part business review, part personal reflection with the one person who had witnessed his transformation from beginning to end. They met at a steakhouse in Billings, occupying a private booth where business could be discussed without concern for eavesdropping. After addressing company matters, the conversation turned to the personal journey of the past year. "You've come through the fire," Vince observed, swirling his whiskey thoughtfully. "Different than you were before, but intact." Frank nodded, transformed rather than destroyed. "It could have gone either way. There were moments I worried," Vince admitted. "When you were tracking Damon's every move, documenting Nora's daily activities, calculating each response with that. It was effective but concerning." "It was necessary," Frank replied, "but it wasn't sustainable or healthy." And now? Where does Frank Harlow stand a year after launching the most meticulously executed revenge plan I've ever witnessed? Frank considered the question seriously. In a place of integration, the strategic clarity remains valuable, the capacity for decisive action when necessary, but balanced with selective trust where earned and focus on building rather than dismantling. And Nora? You've never really talked about where you stand with her beyond the practical co-parenting arrangements. "There's no going back," Frank stated unequivocally. "The marriage is permanently ended. Complete trust is impossible. But we've established a functional relationship that serves Max's needs while maintaining appropriate boundaries." "Not forgiveness, then?" "No." Frank's response was immediate and certain. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition of her efforts toward redemption. Willingness to acknowledge positive change. But not forgiveness in the sense of wiping the slate clean. Vince nodded, accepting this distinction. "Fair enough. Some betrayals are beyond full forgiveness." "Exactly. But that doesn't preclude moving forward with clear eyes and defined parameters." As their dinner concluded, Vince raised his glass in a final toast. to emerging stronger from what could have destroyed a lesser man. Frank returned the gesture, acknowledging the sentiment while recognizing that strength had taken multiple forms throughout the past year, sometimes as unyielding resolve, sometimes as calculated patience, and ultimately as the capacity to integrate these qualities with measured re-engagement with life. The following day, a crisp autumn Sunday, Frank took Max to a local park where fallen leaves created natural playscapes for toddler exploration. As Max gleefully gathered colorful maple leaves, Theodore and Martha Reynolds arrived for a planned meeting, bundled against the increasingly cool Montana weather. "He's getting so big," Martha observed, watching her grandson with evident joy. "And so much like you, Frank, determined, focused, curious about everything." Frank smiled, acknowledging the genetic and environmental influences that were shaping Max's developing personality. He has Nora's creativity too. The way he arranges objects, sees patterns, that's all her. This simple acknowledgement, perhaps the first time Frank had voluntarily attributed positive qualities to Nora since the discovery of her betrayal, did not go unnoticed by her parents. Theodore exchanged a glance with Martha, a moment of silent communication between long-married partners. Speaking of Nora, Theodore began carefully. "She mentioned wanting to discuss the holiday schedule with you. Thanksgiving particularly." Frank nodded, the reference to Thanksgiving carrying unavoidable significance given the events of the previous year. "We'll need to coordinate. The custody agreement gives us alternating years for major holidays, but there's flexibility if we both agree to modifications." She was hoping. Martha hesitated, then continued. "She was wondering if you might consider a shared family dinner this year. Not at our house, but at neutral territory. A restaurant perhaps, where Max could experience the holiday with both parents without the tension of last year's incident." Frank considered the request thoughtfully, weighing multiple factors. Max's benefit from seeing his parents cooperating, the symbolic significance of transforming last year's flashpoint into something constructive, the boundaries he still needed to maintain for his own well-being. "I'll discuss it with her directly," he decided finally. "It might be workable with proper parameters." Theodore nodded, clearly pleased but not pressing further. That's all she's hoping for, consideration rather than automatic refusal. After Theodore and Martha departed with promises to visit again the following weekend, Frank returned to the main house with a sleepy Max ready for his afternoon nap. While his son slept, Frank opened his journal and made a comprehensive entry that reflected his current perspective on the past year's journey and the path forward. Anniversary assessment. Primary objectives achieved beyond initial projections. D. Permanently neutralized professionally, financially, legally. N. Recalibrated into appropriate co-parent role with demonstrated stability and recognition of boundaries. M. Thriving within structured environment that prioritizes his security and development. Secondary developments exceed tactical calculations. Personal integration progressing effectively, balancing strategic capacity with selective re-engagement. Business expansion creating new opportunities beyond original scope. Supporting relationships, T&M, V, professional network, strengthened rather than compromised by events. Remaining consideration. Thanksgiving proposal represents symbolic opportunity to demonstrate transition from retribution phase to sustainable coexistence phase. Controlled engagement maintains boundaries while acknowledging progress. Therapeutic value for M in witnessing functional adult interaction rather than continued conflict or cold detachment. Decision. Proceed with modified acceptance of shared holiday meal under specific conditions that protect all parties' interests while prioritizing M's experience. Not reconciliation or forgiveness, but pragmatic evolution toward optimal outcome for primary beneficiary, M. The following day, Frank contacted Nora directly to discuss the Thanksgiving proposal. Their conversation was brief but substantive, establishing clear parameters for a shared meal at a private dining room in Billings' most upscale restaurant. Neutral territory that offered both privacy and the formality that would maintain appropriate boundaries. "Thank you for considering this," Nora said, as their discussion concluded. I know it's a significant step given what happened last year. It's practical, Frank replied, neither cold nor warm. Max benefits from seeing us interact respectfully. That's my priority. Mine too, Nora agreed. Always. As October progressed toward November, Frank maintained his attention to all aspects of his life. The security business, Max's development, the property investments, and the carefully calibrated co-parenting relationship with Nora. What had changed was not his fundamental approach to life, but rather the objectives toward which it was directed. Construction rather than destruction, forward movement rather than retribution. The anniversary of the Thanksgiving confrontation approached with a certain symbolic weight that Frank neither dwelled upon nor ignored. It represented both the most public manifestation of his strategic response to betrayal and the beginning of the transition from active dismantling to rebuilding. On Thanksgiving morning, Frank dressed with deliberate care, selecting attire that projected confident professionalism without unnecessary formality. He helped Max into the special outfit they had chosen together, a small but significant acknowledgement of his son's growing autonomy and preferences. Before leaving for the restaurant where they would meet Nora and her parents, Frank stood for a moment on the deck of the main house, observing the Montana landscape transformed by early winter frost. A year earlier, he had orchestrated a precisely targeted explosion that had shattered the illusions and deceptions surrounding his family. Today, he would demonstrate with equal that moving forward required neither forgiveness nor continued vengeance. Simply clear boundaries and selective engagement based on earned trust rather than assumed entitlement. The restaurant had prepared the private dining room exactly as specified, elegant but not intimate, with seating arranged to facilitate conversation while maintaining appropriate personal space. Frank arrived first with Max, ensuring everything was in order before the others joined them. Nora entered accompanied by her parents, her expression reflecting nervous determination. She had clearly prepared for this meeting with the same care Frank had, choosing attire that was appropriate without attempting to evoke memories of their past relationship. "Happy Thanksgiving," she offered as they took their seats, her voice steady despite evident tension. "Happy Thanksgiving," Frank replied, his tone neutral but not cold. Max has been looking forward to seeing everyone together. The meal progressed with surprisingly functional interaction, focused primarily on Max and neutral topics, community developments, Theodore's golf game, Martha's volunteer work. There were moments of awkwardness, but no significant tension, each adult working consciously to create a positive experience for Max while respecting the new dynamics between them. As dessert was served, Theodore raised his glass in a careful toast to family in all its forms and configurations. To moving forward, Frank met Nora's eyes briefly across the table as they acknowledged the toast, seeing in her expression recognition of both how much had been lost and what had been preserved through the painful transformation of the past year. There was regret there, certainly, but also acceptance of consequences and determination to build something worthwhile from what remained. It wasn't forgiveness that remained beyond what Frank could or would offer. It wasn't reconciliation. The trust destroyed could never be fully restored. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of something that transcended both the idealized past they had lost and the calculated conflict that had followed betrayal. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Max securely held between them. Nora spoke quietly to Frank. "I know this doesn't change anything fundamental between us," she said, "but thank you for allowing us to create a better memory of Thanksgiving for Max. For all of us." Frank nodded, acknowledging the significance without overstating it. He deserves parents who can interact without conflict, regardless of their personal history. "Yes," Nora agreed. "He does." After a pause, she added, "We can't change the past, Frank. I'll always regret what I did, the choices I made. But today felt like, not healing exactly, but perhaps the beginning of something sustainable." Sustainable is an appropriate objective, Frank conceded. Max has years of development ahead. We'll be connected through him regardless of our personal history. As they parted, Max going with Frank according to their custody schedule, Frank reflected on the significance of this reconstructed Thanksgiving. A year earlier, He had stood at the Reynolds door with his son in his arms and a devastating gift designed to detonate Damon Fletcher's carefully constructed deceptions. Today, he walked away with that same son, having demonstrated that justice and consequences did not require perpetual conflict. That evening, after Max was asleep, Frank made a final journal entry to mark the anniversary and the transition it represented. Thanksgiving recalibration complete. Symbolic significance established through controlled interaction rather than conflict, and benefited from functional adult dynamics while appropriate boundaries maintained, and demonstrated continued commitment to improved co-parenting approach without attempting to minimize past actions or their consequences. Assessment 1 year post-implementation. Justice achieved through systematic response to betrayal. Consequences administered proportionally to actions. Threat neutralized permanently. Family structure reconfigured to prioritize M's well-being while acknowledging fundamental trust breach. Personal evolution summary. The man who discovered betrayal no longer exists. The cold strategist who orchestrated consequences has served his purpose. Current integration represents optimal adaptation, strategic clarity, and boundary maintenance, combined with capacity for selected engagement where appropriate. Trust remains conditional and limited. Forgiveness remains unwarranted and unnecessary. Moving forward without forgetting or forgiving. In the days following Thanksgiving, Frank found himself reflecting on the symbolic significance of having transformed a flashpoint of conflict into a demonstration of functional coexistence. The precise tactical thinking that had guided his campaign against Damon and Nora now served a different purpose, constructing a sustainable future that protected what mattered without requiring continued investment in retribution. December arrived with Montana's characteristic winter intensity. As Christmas approached, Frank maintained the careful boundaries established with Nora while allowing specific accommodations that served Max's interests. Joint present selection, coordinated holiday activities, even a brief Christmas morning overlap where Max could experience both parents sharing in his excitement without pretense of reconciliation. Throughout these interactions, Frank observed Nora with clinical detachment tempered by recognition of her consistent effort. The woman who had betrayed him so completely continued demonstrating commitment to reformed priorities and appropriate boundaries. Frank acknowledged this progress without confusing it with reasons for forgiveness. Accountability and consequences remained permanent fixtures in their reconfigured relationship. On New Year's Eve, with Max asleep after an evening of age-appropriate celebration, Frank stood on the deck of the main house, watching the distant fireworks over Billings while completing his final journal entry of a transformative year. Conclusion of accountability implementation phase. All objectives achieved with optimal efficiency. Neutralized permanently through combination of strategic pressure and self-destructive response. Repositioned appropriately with clear understanding of permanent consequences for betrayal. Secured in stable environment with functional co-parenting structure. Forward trajectory. Maintained boundaries without requiring continued active enforcement. Allowed demonstrated consistency to earn proportional flexibility where beneficial to M. Remain vigilant without allowing vigilance to become primary focus. Apply lessons regarding trust and strategic assessment to all future relationships without allowing past betrayal to prevent selective connection where warranted. Final assessment. Some actions carry permanent consequences. Some betrayals remain unforgivable. But the absence of forgiveness does not preclude moving forward with clear vision and recalibrated expectations. The past year has demonstrated that justice served cold is most effective, and that true strength lies not in destruction, but in the calculated decision regarding what to rebuild and what to leave in ruins. Frank closed his journal as midnight approached, symbolically concluding the documentation of his response to betrayal. The meticulously recorded strategy had served its purpose, creating a comprehensive record of both actions taken and lessons learned. Whatever the future held, for himself, for Max, for the carefully managed relationship with Nora, Frank had demonstrated that betrayal always carries consequences, that trust once broken remains conditionally granted at best, and that moving forward requires neither forgiveness nor forgetfulness, but rather clear-eyed acceptance of permanent transformations. As the new year began with Montana's sky alight with celebratory displays, Frank Harlow stood as living testimony to a fundamental truth. A man pushed to his limits doesn't simply survive or break. He transforms into something both familiar and unrecognizable, carrying forward elements of who he was while integrating the hard-earned wisdom of calculated consequence. Some debts can never be fully repaid. Some actions